air carries both the damp weight of early nightfall and the faint, lingering scent of damp paper from the Bodleian. I had left the office earlier than usual, though not by much, drawn more by the need to walk through the streets than any particular appointment. The bells of the college towers, though miles apart in reality, seemed to blend into a single, melancholic rhythm, chiming in uneven intervals as if arguing among themselves over the passing hours. Each peal struck me with the familiar ache of a city that moves with intellect, yet breathes in shadows. I found myself wandering down Cat Street, my coat collar raised against a drizzle that had begun without fanfare. A small crowd lingered outside a cafe, muffled conversations leaking from under umbrellas. One remark, half a laugh, half a cautionary whisper, caught my attention. It concerned a minor accident at St. Edmund's College. A choir master, they said, had taken a fall during rehearsal. I noted their gestures more than their words, a hand that lingered too long on a shoulder, the tilt of a head that seemed unwilling to meet another's eyes. These details have a habit of persisting in memory. Passing through Tom Quad, the stones slick beneath my shoes, I was aware of the faint scent of incense drifting from the chapel, mingled with the earthy odour of wet leaves pressed against the walls. The city seemed to hold its breath as I paused to watch the soft amber light spilling from windows, each one revealing fragments of lives more private than I could hope to understand. From a distance, a piano note struck, sudden and bright, then faded like a thought receding. I arrived at the college gates without realizing the length of my wandering, a feeling of suspended expectation in my chest. The accident report was already in the newspaper, though no one had yet attached suspicion to it. I suppose it was curiosity, or the sense that what was presented on the page was never quite the whole story, that compelled me to glance at the notice board. A student had pinned a brief poem there, unsigned and smudged by rain. The lines suggested danger lurking in places otherwise sanctified by music and routine. The rhyme was imperfect, the rhythm off, yet it lingered in the mind, a minor puzzle waiting to be unfolded. Even as I noted the subtle irregularities, my mind traced them to the others I had glimpsed earlier, the small contradictions in their gestures and expressions. The tenor who seemed too eager to comment on nothing, the soprano whose gaze avoided the piano, the organist whose hands, though steady on the rail, betrayed a hidden tension. One detail, insignificant at the time, had lodged itself quietly behind my ribs the way the choirmaster's fall was described in the newspaper, the choice of words, the casual certainty. Something about it did not sit right, a minor infraction of truth that demanded attention. I lingered on the steps a moment longer, the bells resuming their solemn insistence. Rain had increased to a soft drizzle, painting the quad stones in reflective shades. I inhaled, taking in the mingled scent of damp paper, wet stone, and the faint perfume of autumn leaves crushed beneath hurried feet. There was no urgency in my thoughts, only the quiet accumulation of details like sediment settling in water, waiting for a single ripple to disturb the calm. That evening, as the bells rang again, I realized that some fall, some interruption of order, would echo far beyond the immediate, reaching into hidden chambers of memory, ambition, and regret. The morning after that damp evening, the office smelled faintly of yesterday's rain, and the stubborn trace of pipe tobacco. Lewis had already left for the station, leaving the silence of the room to be broken only by the occasional scratch of a pen on paper from some distant student in the corridor. I had just settled into the high-backed chair, the leather creaking under my weight, when a soft knock at the door drew my attention. No one entered, but a folded note lay on the floor, where it had evidently been slipped beneath the door. The paper was thin, slightly damp at the edges, and the handwriting unfamiliar, angular, and deliberate. I unfolded it carefully. A poem unsigned, composed in short, jagged lines, each word seemingly chosen for its sound rather than sense. The opening verse spoke of shadows among the choir, of whispers trailing the ascent of stairs, of a fall that echoed silently. I read it twice, the letters blurring slightly as my mind traced the cadence, until a minor anomaly struck me. One line misquoted a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost. The error was subtle, a single word substituted, yet it was enough to suggest that the writer knew the poem intimately, or perhaps had an agenda of misdirection. Something about the substitution felt deliberate, a small signal within the larger murk of ambiguity. Lewis returned shortly, carrying a newspaper clipping damp from the drizzle outside. The headline was stark. The choirmaster of St. Edmund's had died, his fall at rehearsal attributed to a misstep on the stairs. Officially, an accident. I noticed his brow crease as he handed me the paper, as though he half expected me to see the incongruities already settling between the lines. I nodded in silence, my fingers brushing the poem once more, comparing its phrasing with the printed report. A minor discrepancy in timing, an inconsistency in description, a pause in the narrative, the sort of thing easily overlooked by those satisfied with surface appearances. I stepped toward the window, glancing at the rain-forming rivulets along the glass, each stream bending light in its own subtle way. My thoughts traced the possibilities, the likely suspects, and the latent tensions hinted at by the anonymous note. There was a rhythm to the misquote, a pattern perhaps unnoticed by the casual reader that suggested both literary erudition and a careful manipulation of truth. The hand that wrote this note had observed, had catalogued, and had chosen this particular moment to draw attention to a singular, precarious event. Later I wandered briefly through the college grounds, the mist curling around the quad and the scent of wet stone pressing itself into memory. I noted the angles of shadows, the subtle tilts of window blinds, the faint echo of footsteps in empty corridors. One small detail, almost imperceptible, made me pause a set of footprints diverging from the main stairwell, damp and slightly scuffed, leading to the organ loft. The alignment did not correspond with the official account, yet it matched the rhythm suggested in the poem, as if the author had walked alongside the incident, noting angles and hesitations. Back at the office I placed the newspaper and the note side by side. Their contrasts, both deliberate and accidental, formed a subtle interplay, a minor puzzle. I sensed that the case would demand attention not to the grand gestures but to the minutiae, the choice of a word, the hesitation in a gesture, the misalignment of footsteps. The anonymous note was less a message than an invitation, a whispered prompt to see what had been overlooked and to listen for what had been left unspoken. And somewhere within these small, measured details, the truth waited patiently, like the final chord of a minor key yet to sound. The evening found me at St. Edmund's, standing just beyond the heavy oak doors, listening to the faint, methodical strains of rehearsal drifting from the choir stalls. The scent of polished wood and candle wax hung in the air, mingling with the faint dampness that had seeped in through the stone walls. I moved silently along the aisle, my coat brushing against the pews, noting the tension in the air that seemed unrelated to the music itself. Each note was precise, yet there was an undercurrent of hesitation, a subtle discord that suggested more than the mere fall of one man. I watched the choir members with a detached intensity, as though their movements might betray secrets they did not know I sought. The tenor, a young man with a slight stoop, lingered too long on a note, his gaze shifting to the organist with something like resentment. The soprano, poised yet restless, kept glancing toward the piano, her fingers tightening briefly around the hymn book, a gesture almost imperceptible. Even the organist, whose hands moved with professional certainty, carried a tremor beneath the surface, a suppressed cadence that seemed to mirror something buried beneath his composure. I took a slow turn around the perimeter, noting the small details. Others would have dismissed the scuff marks on the polished floor, where chairs had been dragged hastily, the angle of a music stand set slightly off-center, a tiny smudge of ink on the edge of a page. Each was inconsequential in isolation, but together they suggested a sequence of events that contradicted the simple narrative of accident. Somewhere in those shadows, I sensed, lay the rhythm of truth, waiting to be discerned from the hesitations of gestures and misalignments of objects. One particular moment caught my attention. The soprano adjusted her scarf with a motion almost too deliberate, and in the reflection of the polished wood, I noticed her eyes flick toward the rear balcony, where the organ loft rose in silent shadow. The movement was so slight, so easily missed, yet it carried the weight of caution, perhaps even complicity. I filed it away alongside the lines of the anonymous poem and the misquoted Milton, letting the patterns accumulate quietly in the recesses of thought, like sediment settling beneath water. As rehearsal concluded, the residual echo of music lingered, pressing against the vaulted ceilings and bouncing from stone to stone. I spoke with a few of the choir members, careful to let questions drift almost conversationally, noting inflections, the absence of hesitation where it might have been expected, the too eager clarifications that often conceal rather than reveal. The tenor's response to a question about rehearsal order seemed rehearsed itself, a mirror of the music's own tension. I made a mental note, the sort of minor deduction that would later demand closer inspection. Exiting through the rear corridor, the creak of the floorboards under my boots sounded unusually sharp, resonating in the stillness. Rain had begun again, seeping through a narrow window and pooling in a corner where no one would ordinarily look. It occurred to me that a small detail, perhaps the angle of a wet footprint, perhaps a misplaced sheet of music, might hold the key to unraveling the delicate threads of motive and opportunity. The evening left me with a quiet ache, a feeling that the truth was present yet intentionally obscured, woven into shadows that danced among the choir stalls, waiting for a patient mind to observe. I returned to my flat that evening with a quiet insistence of unease, pressing at the edges of thought, the rain still tracing rivulets along the window panes. The office had felt too confined, the corridors of St. Edmund's still echoing with the residual tension of rehearsals and subtle glances. I set down my briefcase and poured a measure of whisky, letting the amber liquid catch the light and deepen the shadows on the walls. The crossword lay open on the small table by the chair, half finished, the ink smudged slightly from yesterday's drizzle that had infiltrated my coat pocket. There is a certain satisfaction in the deliberate pace of a puzzle, each clue a minor universe, each answering a bridge to an unexpected connection. The clue marked across 14 down, choir's end. 5 letters seemed innocent enough at first, yet the phrasing nagged at me. I traced the letters with my finger, musing over the possible interpretations. It was not the solution itself, but the construction, the subtle interplay of language that drew my attention to a minor misalignment, a hidden metaphor. In a way that only becomes apparent when the mind is inclined toward quiet observation, the clue mirrored the arrangement of the choir stalls themselves. An overlooked row, a misnumbered pew, an angle of seating previously dismissed details, small enough to escape casual notice, but pregnant with significance. I recalled the anonymous poem from the morning, the minor misquote of Milton, the pauses between lines that seemed to echo certain gestures I had observed, the tenor's hesitation on a high note, The soprano's cautious glances, even the organist's faintly trembling hand, were all parts of a pattern faintly suggested by the puzzle. I made a note of the correspondence in my notebook, the small, almost imperceptible symmetry between the literary distortion and the physical arrangement of the room. There is a peculiar pleasure and a subtle melancholy in realizing that such things connect. Later, I examined the choirmaster's personal effects retrieved from his study at the college. A torn diary page fell open under my fingers, its edges frayed, ink faint. The notation was cryptic, a brief record of rehearsal times and annotations regarding individual voices, yet one detail lingered, a marginal marking beside the soprano's name, almost imperceptible, a dash that had escaped prior attention. It aligned curiously with the puzzle clue, though its meaning remained opaque. I scribbled the observation, aware that such minutiae rarely reveal themselves immediately, yet hold the key to understanding what seems random or coincidental. The phone rang briefly, startling in the quiet of the flat, but I let it ring until it ceased, unwilling to interrupt the rhythm of deduction. Silence returned, punctuated only by the occasional sigh of rain against the window, a faint creak of the floorboards, the distant chime of a college bell. I returned to the crossword, filling in the final letters slowly, deliberately, letting the solution's echo resonate alongside the minor revelation from the diary. There is, I thought, a curious satisfaction in the quiet accumulation of evidence, a sense that understanding comes not through immediate clarity, but through measured attention to the faintest hint. By the time I set down my pen, the room was dim except for the soft glow of a lamp. Each puzzle solved, each minor incongruity noted, brought me closer to a rhythm of comprehension, though the whole remained tantalizingly incomplete. The details, like raindrops on stone, glistened momentarily before merging into the shadows. Somewhere within these measured observations, the truth awaited, concealed behind gestures, notes, and angles that only patience and reflection could illuminate. And I, with the crossword and the marginal dash, felt the faint stirrings of that quiet, inevitable revelation. The following morning brought a pale light that seemed reluctant to fully enter Oxford's narrow streets, the kind of light that turns wet stone into something almost spectral. I found myself walking toward the college once more, the damp air clinging to my coat, the smell of paper from the library stacks mixing with the faint, lingering scent of rain. I had intended to speak with the administrative staff, the sort of people who observe more than they speak, whose memories preserve small discrepancies unnoticed by the casual eye. It was not interrogation I sought, but recollection, the whispered recollections of those whose attentions were both minor and precise. I began with the registrar, a quiet man whose glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. He recalled the choirmaster's last rehearsal with an uneasy diligence, noting the unusual timing, the slight changes in seating, the tenor's insistence on remaining near the organ. Each phrase was delivered as if it had been rehearsed for the benefit of memory itself. I noted the registrar's pauses, the way his fingers twined around a ledge of the desk, his eyes occasionally flicking to the window as if to check the passage of time. Small gestures like these, I have found, are often more revealing than the spoken recollection. Next, I spoke with a former student, someone who had known the choirmaster and had returned briefly to consult on a musical project. She recalled a minor disagreement regarding scholarships, words exchanged in a corridor that now seemed trivial, but had, in retrospect, carried an intensity uncharacteristic of academic discourse. I observed the way her lips pressed together as she recounted the incident, the faint quiver of a hand that betrayed the lingering emotion beneath the composed surface. The combination of pride, resentment, and a touch of romantic tension was something I filed away mentally alongside the minor clues already accumulated. The tenor himself was reluctant to speak, shifting from foot to foot, his gaze frequently dropping to the polished floor. Yet he provided detail nonetheless, the precise arrangement of the choir stalls, a small error in the rehearsal notes that had been quietly corrected by the soprano, and the subtle irritation in the organist's manner. Each recollection seemed trivial in isolation, but began to align with earlier observations, the slightly misaligned music stand, the shadow cast across a corner of the floor, the incidental note left in the choirmaster's diary. These coincidences, minor as they seemed, were the threads from which a pattern could be drawn. I wandered briefly into the choir stalls alone, allowing the silence to settle over me. The scent of waxed wood and faint dust pressed against memory, the echo of footsteps barely perceptible against stone. I paused at the rear, tracing the angles of shadow, the faint scuff marks in the aisle, imagining the movement of each individual as recounted, reconstructing gestures that had once seemed insignificant. A slight tilt of a hymnboard, a hesitation in turning a page, an almost imperceptible signal began to coalesce into a rhythm that suggested both opportunity and subtle intention. As I left the sky grey and insistent, I realized that the sum of these whispered recollections was greater than the parts. They suggested motives layered beneath pride and regret, small tensions inflating into something larger, and alliances formed and broken in the quiet spaces of music and memory. And as always, the challenge lay not in the surface narrative, but in the intervals between words, the shadows cast by gestures, the minor echoes that persist long after the choir has ceased, and the corridors fall silent once more. It was late afternoon when I returned to St. Edmund's, the clouds heavy and low, spilling rain that pressed against the leaded windows like hesitant fingers. I had resolved to speak with the organist, a man whose hands were precise, whose posture was rigid, yet whose presence suggested unspoken burdens. The corridors were quiet, the echo of my footsteps mingling with distant dripping from the eaves, a rhythm as subtle as a heartbeat, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore once attention had been claimed. The organ loft smelled faintly of wood polish and candle smoke, the kind of scent that clings to memory. He was seated at the bench, hands resting lightly upon the keys, though he did not play. I noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in a finger as it hovered above the pedals, as if rehearsing a gesture that had once been familiar and now was laced with restraint. He greeted me with measured civility, the sort of cordiality that conceals more than it reveals, and we spoke in quiet tones, the conversation almost indistinguishable from his musings about registration and timbre. I mentioned the fall of the choirmaster, observing carefully his reactions. His eyes flicked toward a narrow window, the movement brief, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of memory. A slight catch in his breath accompanied a pause that seemed to stretch, revealing an interior hesitation he did not attempt to disguise. I inquired casually about rehearsal schedules, noting the discrepancies he provided, times that did not entirely align with the diary entries, minor adjustments that might have seemed insignificant, yet in combination suggested an orchestrated attention to detail. Later, I asked about correspondence he had received recently, letters that might explain tensions or grievances. He produced a set of envelopes, each neatly arranged, yet one, slightly damp at the corner, bore a seal I did not recognize. I examined it in the muted light, noting the faint smudge of ink, the careful handwriting that had deliberately avoided scrutiny. It suggested observation, perhaps even manipulation. A small margin note in the choirmaster's logbook corresponded to the date on the envelope, indicating a meeting that had been undocumented elsewhere. Yes, hidden exchange that implied motive yet deferred certainty. The organist's composure remained intact, yet I observed the minute micro-expressions that accumulate beneath deliberate restraint, a furrowed brow when discussing the soprano's enthusiasm, a subtle tightening of lips regarding the tenor's questions, the brief glance toward the rear balcony where minor inconsistencies in foot traffic had previously been noted. I catalogued these as one might collect faint echoes in a quiet chamber, aware that the significance of such minor details often reveals itself only when juxtaposed with other patterns. I walked back through the rain-slick quad, the scent of wet stone and autumn leaves pressing against memory. The organist's secret, whatever its precise nature, was less a revelation than a puzzle piece, subtle in its placement, waiting for the accumulation of further details to render it luminous. And I felt the familiar ache of understanding something not fully spoken, of knowing that the quiet, disciplined gestures of a man could conceal both truth and quiet culpability within their measured restraint. The day had grown long, and a mist had begun to settle over the college, softening edges and muting the colours of stone and leaf. I found myself walking again through the quads, the soles of my shoes sending up faint echoes against the damp flagstones, wondering at the way certain details insist upon lingering, though their significance remains uncertain. There were two individuals whose presence that day seemed to demand the attention of the visiting scholar from abroad, and the alumnus returned briefly for consultation. Both displayed civility, but beneath the polite phrasing I sensed undercurrents that warranted careful inspection. The scholar carried himself with the composed detachment of someone accustomed to observation, yet in conversation a subtle impatience betrayed him. His hands, when he gestured toward the choir stalls, trembled slightly, a micro-gesture easily overlooked, but revealing the faint tension between assurance and unease. The alumnus, by contrast, exhibited a careful attentiveness, correcting minor details of rehearsal that were otherwise insignificant, suggesting both pride and a lingering attachment to authority. It is the way such gestures accumulate that signals their potential relevance. I spoke with each separately, noting the discrepancies in their accounts, the tiny contradictions in timing, and the slight overemphasis on inconsequential details. The scholar insisted the soprano had arrived precisely on schedule, though my own observations suggested she had lingered in the rear corridor. The alumnus recalled the tenor being at the organ when, in fact, I had noted his presence at the far side of the stalls. These inconsistencies were themselves minor, almost playful in their effect, yet they added layers of complexity, red herrings that could mislead without careful attention. Later, in the library, I examined old scores and marginal annotations left by the choirmaster. A faint note regarding rehearsal adjustments corresponded strangely with the scholar's timing, though the content suggested no malicious intent. Meanwhile, a second annotation hinted at unresolved disputes between the alumnus and the organist, yet it revealed only partial information. Such fragments are easily misread, tempting the observer toward premature conclusions. I placed each observation alongside the anonymous note, the misquoted Milton, and the marginal diary notation, aware that their interrelation might either illuminate or obscure the truth. By late afternoon, I wandered again through the corridors, tracing the angles of shadow, the positions of chairs, the subtle disturbances in dust upon the floor. Both the scholar and the alumnus had provided information that seemed consequential, yet closer inspection suggested a different purpose, distraction. The more one seeks clarity amid these layers, the more one realizes that human beings, in their pride and caution, often reveal less than they intend and misdirect more than they know. The pleasure lies in observing the dance, noting the rhythm, the hesitations, and the invisible threads connecting gesture to intent. As I left the college that evening, the mist had thickened, cloaking the quads in an ethereal grey. The red herrings, for now, remained unresolved, lingering like shadows that follow closely but disappear upon scrutiny. It is a curious phenomenon, familiar to anyone who observes carefully. The mind is drawn to apparent patterns, yet the truth waits patiently in the spaces between, in the subtleties, the hesitations, and the almost imperceptible gestures. And as always, the challenge is not merely to discern the false from the true, but to recognize that the false can itself illuminate the contours of reality when approached with patience and care. The morning was chill, the mist curling over the college quads like a hesitant memory when I returned to St. Edmund's to examine the archives more closely. The library's air was thick with the scent of old paper and wax polish, faintly sweet and insistent, carrying with it the quiet murmurs of students long gone. I made my way past the rows of ledgers and hymnals, guided by the flickering light from tall windows, and there, partially obscured behind a stack of recital programs, I found it a ledger I had not noticed before, its binding worn, the edges dusted with neglect. The choirmaster's meticulous hand had inscribed notes not meant for casual perusal. The entries were mundane at first glance: rehearsal times, allocations of stalls, minor alterations to the music schedule. Yet as I traced my finger along the lines, subtle patterns emerged, coded annotations almost invisible, a dash here, a dot there, underlined entries that corresponded to individuals rather than music. A series of initials, some familiar, others obscure, recurred with curious frequency. The soprano, the tenor, the organist, even the visiting scholar appeared repeatedly in association with slight variations in timing, suggesting a deliberate record of movement and preference. I paused at one set of entries that seemed almost trivial. A note beside the tenor's name, indicating he had arrived a minute early on 2 separate occasions. One might dismiss this, yet it matched precisely with the faint impression left on the floorboards I had noted earlier. Footprints, damp and slightly scuffed, corresponded almost exactly with the ledger's recording. It was an alignment so subtle that the mind might easily ignore it, yet to me it suggested an attention to sequence and presence, a quiet orchestration of opportunity hidden in plain sight. Other annotations hinted at tension, a ledgered record of grudges disguised as routine administration. A cryptic dash beside the organist's initials seemed almost to mock the neat order of rehearsals, while marginal notes about the soprano contained phrasing that implied observation, judgment, and perhaps a minor sense of warning. I copied these carefully, the small, precise act of transcription feeling like the brushing aside of dust to reveal something quietly persistent beneath. As I leaned back in the solitary corner, the library's silence pressed against me. The faint echo of my own breathing, the occasional creak of a floorboard, and the distant hum of Oxford beyond the windows reminded me how the smallest gestures can contain meaning. The ledger, in its patient accumulation of detail, had recorded movements and interactions that were invisible to casual observation, a temporal map of intentions, hesitations, and minor conflicts. Later in the chapel, I allowed my thoughts to drift over the arrangement of the stalls once more, reconstructing the day-to-day flow of rehearsal. The ledger's coded notes, aligned with the echoes I had observed, the hesitation of a glance, the subtle change in step, the shift of a music stand began to suggest a rhythm beneath the apparent disorder. A puzzle of human behavior, pride, and quiet resentment had been silently transcribed in meticulous script, awaiting the patient reader. I left the archives with a sense of measured anticipation, the ledger tucked under my arm. Rain had begun again outside, the wet stone reflecting the dim light in broken, flickering patterns. Somewhere within these accumulated details, the misquoted Milton, the anonymous poem, the ledgered annotations, lay the contours of motive and opportunity, waiting to be traced, understood, and eventually unravelled. And as I walked back through the misted quad, I felt the familiar ache of comprehension not yet complete, a truth half hidden, like the final chord of a song that fades just before it reaches its conclusion. I returned to my flat that evening with a ledger tucked under my arm and a quiet sense of accumulation pressing against the edges of thought. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, the streets reflecting the diffuse light of gas lamps and the occasional glint from the wet cobblestones. Sitting at my desk, I spread out the ledger, the anonymous poem, the diary fragment, and the newspaper clipping. Each element seemed unremarkable on its own, yet together they formed a lattice of possibility, waiting for a patient mind to discern the contours hidden beneath surface chaos. I revisited the misquoted Milton in my mind, the minor substitution of words that suggested observation rather than error. It aligned, almost imperceptibly, with the ledger's coded entries, the subtle dashes and underlined initials indicating presence, absence, and minor disputes. I traced the paths of footsteps through the choir stalls as described in the diary, noting the faint alignment with the scuff marks and the angles of light I had observed earlier. It was as if the building itself had preserved the movement of human ambition and restraint, waiting for someone to read the quiet record embedded in its stone and wood. The tenor's hesitation, recalled from whispered recollections, now appeared in a new light. His glances, the minor irregularities in timing, and the ledger annotations together suggested a familiarity with the movements of others that extended beyond mere rehearsal. Similarly, the soprano's careful glances and precise corrections of musical notation revealed not only diligence but the subtle manipulation of perception. I found myself reconstructing the chain of events in slow, deliberate sequences, imagining how small gestures too slight for ordinary notice could redirect opportunity, provoke suspicion, and conceal intent. A single detail, initially overlooked, began to assert its quiet insistence on a note in the ledger beside the organist's initials, faint and almost accidental, yet directly corresponding to a footfall I had traced weeks before. Its placement suggested both foresight and caution, an awareness of the environment that only someone intimately familiar with the rhythm of rehearsals could possess. This minor alignment of movement, annotation, and gesture formed a nexus around which the narrative began to coalesce. I revisited the anonymous poem, reading aloud the lines that spoke of shadows and echoes in the choir stalls. The phrasing now resonated differently, pointing to deliberate observation, the chronicling of minor transgressions and hesitations that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Each element, each minor discrepancy, suddenly became a component of a larger pattern, a mosaic of motive and opportunity, delicately concealed in plain sight. By the time darkness pressed fully against the window panes, I had sketched the sequences in my notebook, connecting ledger entries with gestures, diary notes with misquotes, footprints with hesitation. The red herrings, the scholar's anxious glances, the alumnus's careful insistence, the superficially inconsequential errors in rehearsal had served their purpose, distracting, while the true alignment emerged gradually. I sensed the approach of clarity, a slow accumulation rather than sudden revelation, a recognition that the architecture of the crime lay not in a single dramatic gesture but in the quiet, repeated movements of those involved. I leaned back in my chair, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the spread of papers and annotations. Outside, rain tapped against the window, the muffled chiming of distant bells marking the passage of time. The pieces, at last, were settling into place, not yet revealing the whole, but hinting at the pattern, the rhythm, and the subtle orchestration that had governed the events in the choir stalls. and in that quiet arrangement the ache of understanding was both satisfying and incomplete, a familiar accompaniment to every case that relies upon observation, reflection, and patience, rather than spectacle. The day I chose to confront the matter in the choir stalls, Oxford seemed to hold its breath, the mist curling between the stone pillars, and wet leaves lying like muted confessions across the quads. The air carried the faint scent of candle-wax, rain, and aged wood, and even the distant hum of a piano from another college seemed hushed, as though the city itself knew of the quiet reckoning approaching. I arrived early, letting the emptiness of the stalls sink into memory, tracing the familiar angles, the minor scuffs, the imperfections in alignment that had persisted unnoticed by others. The organist was already present, seated with hands folded, the usual composure slightly diminished by anticipation. He did not rise, and I noted the way his gaze followed the length of the aisle with a subtle tension that suggested recognition rather than surprise. The soprano and tenor arrived shortly after, their steps cautious, measured, each carrying the weight of expectation that was not entirely theirs to bear. The quiet of the room pressed upon us, and I allowed it to linger before speaking, permitting gestures, postures, and hesitations to reveal themselves. I began by reviewing the ledger and diary annotations aloud, careful to observe the micro-expressions that flitted across faces. The misalignments in rehearsal notes, the coded markings, the faint echoes of the anonymous poem all were described neutrally, the words themselves unremarkable, yet the weight of their implication impossible to deny. I noticed the brief, almost imperceptible flinch of the organist when a date corresponding to a rehearsal was mentioned, and the soprano's eyes narrowed slightly at a marginal note that referenced her own adjustments to seating. These minor gestures, long catalogued, now held a quiet insistence. The conversation drifted to recent rehearsals, each participant recounting events with precision tempered by instinctive reticence. A pause, a hesitation, a carefully over-articulated point, these were the moments that allowed the underlying narrative to emerge. I had long suspected that the fall had been more than an accident, yet it was not recklessness nor malice that guided the act, but a confluence of opportunity, pride, and subtle misjudgment revealed only by careful attention to alignment, timing, and the human inclination to manipulate perception. I traced, step by step, the movements through the stalls, comparing memory with ledger, observation with testimony. The organist's subtle placement of his feet, the tenor's momentary glance to a rear column, the soprano's slight adjustment of the hymn book, all these aligned in a manner that left little ambiguity. The fall, once seen as random, now traced a path of minor but deliberate intervention, a reflection of careful observation and restrained intent rather than chaotic accident. I noted with some melancholy that the orchestration of human pride often mirrors music itself, precise, deliberate, and devastating in its final cadence. When the alignment had been reconstructed, the room remained hushed, the weight of understanding pressing without triumph. No dramatics, no confession beyond the measured acknowledgement visible in subtle shifts of posture and fleeting expression. The choir's end was neither theatrical nor violent beyond the confines of expectation. It was precise, quiet, and inevitable once the minor gestures were read with patience. I left the stalls slowly, the echo of careful movement lingering, and understood that in Oxford, as in music, the smallest notes often carry the greatest resonance, and that truth, when revealed, is as much a matter of observation as it is of revelation. Oxford had settled into a peculiar hush by the time I returned to the quads, the rain having ceased but leaving the flagstones slick and reflective, each puddle capturing the diffuse glow of distant lamps like tiny mirrors of the sky. The day's revelations had left the choir stalls quiet, yet laden with memory. Each note, each gesture, each hesitation preserved in the lingering scent of wax and polished wood. I walked slowly, letting the impressions accumulate, aware that the city itself seemed to exhale, releasing the tension of observation and anticipation. The college appeared unchanged, yet subtle shifts revealed themselves: a slightly askew chair, the faint scuff of footsteps along a corridor, the angle of light through a high window, catching a corner of a ledger still open on a library table. Such details are the remnants of presence, the echoes of human intention, preserved in stone and wood, and I traced them as though following a score composed in minor gestures and half-spoken thoughts. Each step drew me closer to understanding the quiet orchestration that had governed events, the subtle manipulation of routine, the faint imprint of pride, jealousy, and regret. I paused at the edge of the quad, noting a solitary figure, one of the choir members, moving with deliberation, lingering perhaps to reflect, perhaps to observe. Their gaze flicked briefly toward the chapel before lowering, and in that instant I understood how much remained unspoken, how much weight was carried in silence. The ledger, the poem, the marginal diary notes, the misquoted Miltonal had combined to produce a delicate lattice of implication. But it was the subtle human gestures, almost imperceptible, that had guided my understanding to its measured conclusion. I allowed myself a slow walk toward the library, the familiar scent of old books mingling with the damp air. The piano in the practice room sounded briefly, a note struck accidentally or deliberately, and I paused, listening, the minor resonance hanging in the silence like a question. Each minor detail, the alignment of scores, the timing of footfalls, the quiet tension in posture, had contributed to an understanding that was both satisfying and incomplete, a recognition of cause without the spectacle of confrontation. Returning to my flat, I poured a modest measure of whisky, the amber liquid catching the lamp's glow and reflecting the faint shadows along the walls. I placed the ledger and notes carefully on the table, each a fragment of the larger narrative, and let my thoughts drift over the sequence of events once more. The fall, once deemed an accident, revealed itself as the product of subtle orchestration, human error, and restrained intent, yet even now some minor nuances remained unresolved, leaving the mind with a quiet ache of recognition rather than triumph. Outside, the city breathed gently, Oxford's towers and spires reflected in pools upon the streets, the sound of distant footsteps mingling with the soft sigh of wind through narrow alleys. I considered the participants, the gestures that had betrayed or concealed, the small, deliberate actions that had directed suspicion and attention. The choir had resumed its rhythm, yet the memory of events pressed beneath each note, faint and persistent, a reminder of human frailty interwoven with pride, talent, and misjudgment. I settled into the chair by the window, the rain-soaked streets quiet, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over the ledger. Even as night deepened, I felt the familiar ache of observation, of understanding the subtle interplay of intention and error, and of leaving some truths half hidden, preserved in the quiet recesses of memory. In Oxford, as in music, the final note often lingers after the performance, resonant, ambiguous, and haunting, marking both completion and the quiet persistence of what remains unsaid. The night had grown deep and still, the quads empty save for the occasional ripple of mist curling along the stone paths. I walked slowly through St. Edmund's, the memory of rehearsals and the fall lingering in the air like a faint echo of music. The choir stalls stood empty now, polished wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight, each pew aligned as though nothing had ever occurred. Yet I knew better. The traces of gestures, hesitations, and careful misdirection had left their subtle marks, as indelible as the footprints in wet stone I had observed weeks before. I paused at the rear balcony, letting my gaze drift over the length of the stalls, the angles of shadows, the slight imperfections in alignment. The ledger, the diary page, the misquoted Milton, the anonymous poem all had revealed a pattern of careful observation, subtle orchestration, and minor pride that culminated in a moment both tragic and inevitable. Each detail I had collected, each gesture recorded in memory, spoke to the deliberate pacing of human intent. It was not the loud theatrics of crime that mattered, but the quiet precision of observation, the alignment of opportunity with the minutiae of behavior. The wind pressed softly against the windows, carrying the faint scent of rain and damp leaves. I leaned lightly against a pew, considering the participants, their movements, and their restrained revelations. The tenor's gaze had betrayed tension, the soprano's glances indicated awareness, the organist's posture suggested long-standing knowledge now revealed only in subtle gestures. These were the marks left by those who moved deliberately, carefully, understanding how easily perception may be guided and misled. I made my way down the aisle, pausing to consider the alignment of the hymn boards and the subtle scuff marks near the organ bench. Each small observation resonated with the ledger's coded notes, the diary's cryptic annotations, the careful poem left anonymously to hint at hidden truths. In their quiet accumulation, the evidence had taken shape not in sensational confession, but in the rhythm of human error and pride, in the intersection of skill, observation, and minor ambition. Outside, the mist had thickened, curling around the quads in pale grey, reflecting light from the distant lamps like scattered notes on an invisible staff. I remained for a moment, inhaling the combined scent of damp stone, polished wood, and faint candle smoke. Memory and observation intertwined, a final chord that lingered beyond the rehearsal, beyond the fall, beyond explanation. Some truths, I realized, exist not for declaration, but for quiet comprehension, leaving space for reflection, and for the imagination to trace what is unspoken. As I stepped into the night, the city held a soft murmur, Oxford breathing gently under the veil of dark and fog. Each element of the case, the ledger, the notes, the gestures, the subtle discrepancies had resolved into a pattern of understanding that was as precise as music, yet as elusive as memory. The choir's final note, in a sense, was not one struck, but one inferred, lingering in the mind, echoing long after the stalls themselves had fallen silent. I paused on the flagstones, the reflections of lamps shimmering in puddles, and allowed the quiet to settle. The final cadence had been reached, not with clarity or triumph, but with the subtle ache of comprehension, the knowledge that human pride and subtle error leave traces that can be read by those willing to observe. In Oxford, as in life, the last note often resonates long after the performance has ended, a quiet, haunting testament to what has been seen, understood, and remembered.